Good evening, I'm Jon Lentz, Seating State's Managing Editor, and this is Last Look. I'm joined today by Blum, Director of Baruch College Survey Research. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I first want to ask you just your thoughts on the polling so far in New York City. It's made a lot of headlines lately. We're getting close to primary day.
It's been wild, and it's been very difficult, and probably I could say that I'm grateful for the fact that this year I'm not polling that contest because I don't think it's easy. First of all, it's the hardest contests to poll are primaries, and especially primaries that have more than a couple of candidates. So the mayoral is really difficult. And when you're talking about polling over the summer, when people aren't paying attention yet, or aren't even around, some not even around, it's particularly difficult. And I think what we saw a lot of this summer was that whoever was sort of in the news or getting a lot of attention suddenly went up in the polls, and and they sort of took turns. But I think that what we've seen in the last few weeks is definitely a de Blasio building momentum in all the polls. We see him going up, and the trend has been only up.
At the same time, there's some different numbers from different polls you have out there. Quinnipiac, I think, has him at 43%, possibly avoiding a runoff. Siena had him actually down at 32%. That might confuse people that just look at this on the surface. What do you explain that?
Okay, well, there can be a couple of things that can be going on here. Obviously, number one, when they had the 32%, it was a bit earlier. There's a little bit of the exactly when in his trajectory they caught the people and how long they were polling, and then there can be obviously some differences in the sampling. Some differences in how they weight their polls, differences in how many cell phone only households they poll, differences in their likely voter screens. All of those things can certainly have a difference on the margins, as well as sort of where they ask the vote question.
Could likely voter methodology throw you off, make you more inaccurate?
Well, depending on what it should make it better than just looking at registered voters, but obviously not everybody's likely voters screen or methodology is the same, and some might be a bit better than others. But even that said, it's so hard to do, and so much of this has been early and with people, like, as I said, not paying attention yet. Not really focused on it yet, and even in these polls you see that there's a lot of people telling you they could still change their mind, and I think that they have along the way, and it's still possible that some of them will, but it's very hard to predict. These are snapshots in time. People are telling you they're going to turn out, they're telling you this is how they feel today, and it's not the poll that's wrong when 2 weeks later that's not who shows up, or that's not how they vote.
At the same time, some experts have said getting the minority vote can be particularly difficult. I think you saw this with Bill Thompson when he was running for mayor in 2009. His share of the African American vote was low, but actually turned out to be much higher at the polls. I think you pointed out in the latest Siena poll, John Liu got 0% in Queens, whereas Anthony Weiner got 17%.
Right, and on the face of it, that does not make sense to me because, first of all, because the Asian vote in 2009 in the primary was around 9 or 10%, and John Liu did best in Queens. Not surprising because that's really the Asian stronghold. That is his base. So the idea that he's getting 0% in Queens, whereas he's getting 6% in some other boroughs, doesn't sound right to me. So I would, if this were my poll, I would be looking into that kind of number more carefully. There are a lot of numbers when you look into the internals where you think, I I'm not quite sure about that. But I'm not privy to everything about the polls, so I can't know everything about how they did what they did.
Purely speculation. Could that be a language issue if you have a lot of minorities?
Yes, it is. It is. First of all, it is definitely, at least in part, a language issue. Jon Lentz has been complaining about that, and he's right. When most of the public opinion polls are done of New York City, the polling is done in English and Spanish. It's generally not done in Mandarin, in Cantonese, in Korean, in any number of other Asian languages, and you will in fact lose a lot of people because you're not polling in those languages.
Another minority group, Hispanics, has been part of some discussion. State Senator Ruben Diaz sent out an email the other day blasting Quinnipiac. He said it didn't list Hispanics in the breakdown of the voters. It just says has blacks, whites, but nothing for Asians, nothing for Hispanics. Is that valid criticism? Are they actually still talking to Hispanics,
Yes,
even
they
if it's
are.
not broken down there?
Yes, they are. And actually, if you look at their demographic breakdown, you see that they are. Whether they didn't feel they had enough to reliably report a result for that group, that may be the reason that they just thought, and it wasn't maybe as clear in a breakdown there. It's been very clear in both of these polls, and I think in most polls, that there's been that the black vote has been divided, but going more and more for de Blasio in the mayoral, and in the controller's race, it's going for Spitzer.
Well, I wanted to ask about that black vote. I think one of the polls showed de Blasio with something like 47%, close to 50% black support, whereas Bill Thompson is more like a quarter. Do you think that's accurate, or is that something you'd want to dig into more if you were doing that poll?
Well, you might want to dig into it, but I think that we have been seeing that sort of building all along, and that going up. It's not as though they've always had it that way. I think that de Blasio has made enormous strides in the black community, as he actually has in the white community. And one of the interesting things about the latest Quinnipiac poll is that de Blasio is essentially winning every demographic, every single demographic, old, young, white, black, men, women. That's unusual. And he was winning with either enough or almost enough to avoid a runoff.
And when I talked to you last week, you drew an analogy to the presidential race
Yes.
in 2008. Tell me about that.
Well, I think that was even more evident the other day in the debate, because de Blasio pointed out that he had sort of these big, bold ideas. This was a city of big, bold ideas. This was change, not the old thinking. He referred to old thinking. Now that clearly, frankly, was a swipe at both Thompson and Quinn, and as sort of the establishment maybe, and maybe an old thinking, not it. And I think that's the kind of thing we saw in 2008, where Obama came in as the change candidate. So we can see in all of these polls that in the Democratic primary, among Democratic primary voters who are the most liberal voters, the strongest Democrats, they are ready for a change. They are not looking mostly to extend the Bloomberg years. Now, that doesn't mean everybody else in the city will feel that way, or that the general election or the general electorate will be that way. But these who are sort of the very strong Democrats who show up in Democratic primaries want change. And if de Blasio is seen as the candidate of change, that's clearly helping.
Another thing I like to dig into with these polls is looking at favorables versus unfavorables, unknown versus known. It looked like in the latest Q poll, Bill de Blasio, still a quarter of the voters don't know enough about him to have an opinion, whether to vote for him or not. Similar for Bill Thompson, and both of them have very low unfavorables, especially compared to Quinn
Right.
and Weiner. What do you make of all that?
Well, Quinn and Weiner are better known, and there are things that they kind of have to defend. Again, in the analogy to 2008, Hillary Clinton was defending her Iraq vote, and that's what she was being attacked about. And this year we see Christine Quinn having to defend her vote on term limits, and that's probably the thing that gets her the most unfavorables. And there are other things about Quinn, sort of as a person, how she comes across versus De Blasio. Again, a similarity to 2008 with a woman who's, to use Barack Obama's phrase, likable enough, but against someone who comes across as perhaps much more relatable and likable, and candidate of change.
Right, and the narrative right now is De Blasio's way in the lead. You have Thompson and Quinn battling it out for second place, maybe getting into a runoff. With these favorable numbers, unfavorable numbers for Quinn and for Thompson, do you think that gives Thompson more of an edge, that maybe he has more room to grow?
Well, he has more room to grow.
Okay.
He certainly has more room to move up. But frankly, if sort of by this time he hasn't, I mean, he's been around a really long time. And we haven't really seen his numbers move much at all. Nor do I think there's been as much of a clear message, perhaps, in his campaign. I mean, Christine Quinn, again, like Hillary, was sort of a candidate stressing she's been there, she's accomplished something, she has a strong record. Look at what I've done, look at my record. De Blasio's is very future-oriented. Here's all the things I want to change and want to do. I think it's been a little less clear with Thompson that there's any kind of clear message. Also, he's not getting this sort of even the fact that Al Sharpton and other people in the Black community haven't lined up behind him is kind of a message that they're not sure that the majority of the Black vote isn't going, or a plurality at least of the Black vote won't go for De Blasio.
And one candidate you do see making some improvement is in the city controller's race. You see Scott Stringer, at least in some polls, moving up. However, that's another one where you have very divergent results between Quinnipiac and Siena. What do you make of all that? How close do you think that race actually is?
Really hard to say. I guess that what I do think we are seeing is I do think that Stringer is probably moving up. I think that when this started, you had a real name recognition difference. Everybody who knew who Eliot Spitzer was, he had been our governor. Nobody outside of Manhattan had any idea who Scott Stringer was. Not even that many people outside of the Upper West Side probably had any idea who Scott Stringer was. So he had to sort of battle that. And he's gotten better known, and he's gotten more and more endorsements, not only from the newspapers, but also from lots of the the political establishment in the city. And I think that I think that's helped him build his numbers quite a bit. And I do, I think again you've got a trajectory. I think that Scott Stringer is getting a little bit more each, probably each week in each poll. Exactly where that's going to end up on September 10th, I'm certainly not going to guess, but I think it will probably be fairly close. There you also have a very big race gap, again, racial gap, but you've got the Black vote going heavily for Spitzer, the white vote going heavily for Stringer. And the oddities and the differences between the polls had to do with the gender differences. The New York Times Siena poll had women going for Spitzer and men splitting the vote. Again, that's one where sort of I would probably look into that more carefully because that doesn't sound quite right. My guess is part of that may be the race difference that they, because there are many more black women voters than black men voters, that there may be a little bit of a mix there, and part of what we might be seeing is that what looks like a gender gap really had to do with that race gap. In the Quinnipiac poll, they kind of have them sort of both splitting, I think, the vote, and again, we don't really know how that looks just among white voters or just among black voters by gender. But my guess is that you probably don't have a gender gap as much in the black vote as you have in the white vote.
Any thoughts on turnout? One number I've heard is 700,000, possibly. You have an open race, pretty competitive.
I think early on everybody thought this was going to be really low because no one seemed interested and no one knew who a lot of these candidates were and no one was excited. I think as time's gone on, there are many more people who've become interested and become excited, and also, I mean, the contests are certainly in the news, so I think that expectations now are going up slightly, and I don't think it will be as low as it was. But again, this is why it's really hard for pollsters. It's really hard to know how many of them will actually show up. There's more reason to show up than if there was an incumbent, but
and just
hard to know exactly.
One last question then, I'd ask you if you could make a prediction. Do you think there will be a runoff in the Democratic primary, and if so, who do you think would be in it?
Wow, I think it's really, really hard to know, because again, this is going to be. It's going to be about turnout. It's going to be about getting out the vote. And so whose unions are getting out their vote? Because that's a very big piece of this. We've certainly seen the teachers union going in very heavily advertising Thompson. If they bring out their vote very strongly, then I think he has a very good chance of being in the runoff if there is a runoff. Does de Blasio have a chance of actually taking it without a runoff? Sure he does. Absolutely, I have no idea and do not want to predict how it will go. I would just say that it is really difficult to do this kind of polling and to really get it that close, because it's a moving target. And maybe if they have a final poll 2 days before the election, it'll give us a better idea. I think it's been really hard to know.
Thank you, Blum. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
And that's it for this episode of Last Look. To check out other Last Look videos, go to our website, www.cityandstateny.com.